to nobody.
Welcome back to Two Nobodies, everyone. Great to be with you. Rupesh is back here with you. Really appreciate you all joining the podcast today and watching all the previous episodes. I have a fantastic episode for you today. Someone reached out to me and wanted to talk about diabetes and the stigmas associated with the disease and people experiencing that disease, and it really intrigued me. I had never really had thought about the topic all that much, and so I'm really pleased to have Chet Galaska join us today. Chet, welcome to Two Nobodies. Appreciate your time, and thanks for reaching out and making me aware of this topic, and really excited to hear about your story and why you do what you do and all that sort of thing. So welcome to Two Nobodies. Appreciate you having you.
Thanks, Rupesh. I'm glad to be here.
Great. So I don't even know where to start. I wonder if we just start as far as why you got into what you're doing and a bit about your story. Maybe that would help. And I'm sure the topic of diabetes, I mean, people know what diabetes is, but they also probably don't know. So we'll probably probe into all of that. But maybe why are you doing this? Why are you doing what you're doing?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting story, Rupesh. I've had type 1 diabetes for over 40 years. So I know diabetes pretty well. At least I thought I did. I'm not a medical person at all. I'm just a businessman. I was president of a company for most of my career. I'm retired now, but now I'm focused on diabetes. Now, the reason for that is that I was in Chicago and an incident happened. Before I explain the incident, you need a little background about diabetes.
Okay.
If people are using insulin, there's a possibility that your blood sugar can go too low. Everybody knows that high blood sugar causes the damage, but low blood sugar is supposed to be a different problem. In the body, the brain takes sugar directly from the bloodstream. It doesn't store it like other parts of the body do. So if there isn't enough sugar in the blood, the brain starts to go haywire. And what will happen is you can start sweating, you lose your coordination, your eyesight gets hazy and fuzzy. Sometimes you see double if it gets low enough. If it gets really low, you can pass out. So low blood sugar is nothing to fool around with. Luckily, it's easy to cure. All you have to do is eat some sugar.
Sure.
And as soon as the sugar gets digested, then the blood sugar comes back up. So it's something that diabetics like me have to watch out for all the time. Today, it's much easier because of the mechanisms we have, the tools where we can check our blood sugar that didn't exist 20 years ago. So what happened in Chicago is that I was in there during the week when Ron Santo was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. Now, this is back in the 1960s. Santo was a star player, but he had type 1 diabetes, so he was using insulin. One day, he's in a game. The Cubs, he's in the on-deck circle. The Cubs are down by 2. There's 2 men on base. It's the last of the 9th, and he feels the low blood sugar reaction coming on. He starts to sweat. And like all other diabetics, me included, you know what the signs are. Well, Santo's problem was that the team didn't know he had diabetes. He was afraid they would fire him if they found out, and he was probably right about that. So he's stuck out there on the on-deck circle, can't go back to the dugout to get a candy bar, and explain to the manager why he's there eating a candy bar in the middle of this critical situation. So he's in the on-deck circle, and he's just praying that the batter at the plate will make an out and retire the side. Well, instead, the guy walks. So now there's 3 men on base. They're down by 2, and Santo comes walking up to the plate. He said he looked up, and there were 30-some-odd people standing in the field because he was seeing triple. So there were 3 pitchers, there were 3 scoreboards, and this is with the low blood sugar. So he said when the pitcher threw the ball, it looked like it had a slinky attached to the back of it. So he took a wild swing at it and put it out of the park for a walk-off grand slam home run. Well, Santo made it around the bases, and he got to the dugout, and he ate his candy bar. And nobody knew that story for 10 years when they celebrated Ron Santo Day when he was retiring. So as a
And then
diabetic,
he told that story then.
he made it public then.
Okay.
At that time, he had been playing ball for 10 years. He was one of the most favorite players in Chicago, and he had gotten 5 Golden Gloves. So at that point, they weren't about to fire him. So he felt free to come out with it. Well, most people read that and say, wow, that's great. He hit a Grand Slam home run. How wonderful is that?
Yeah.
As a diabetic, I'm thinking his real victory was making it back to the dugout without collapsing. Because
100%.
most of us have been there where, man, you feel like your sugar's going low, and man, I hope I can eat that sugar quick enough to avoid any of these problems.
Yeah.
So, for me and other diabetics, we'd say, well, what a great story. It's much greater than somebody who doesn't know about it would think.
Yeah.
So I came home and I started telling that story to people. And I came to realize that most people don't understand diabetes at all. The ignorance is just astonishing. And there are reasons for that. It's not people's fault. It's just the way things are. But what I also discovered is that when they asked me questions about diabetes, I realized how little I knew as well. Now, there are 2 major kinds of diabetes. There's type 1, which I have, and type 2, which is the other 95% for the most part. And when people ask me questions about type 2, I realized that I didn't have the answers. And when I looked into it, I realized that what I had believed about type 2 was wrong. And much of what other people think about it is wrong also. And this creates a problem. Most people think that type 2's got it because they're overweight, sedentary, and they ate too much sugar. And none of those are true. So I can explain to you, why that is. In fact, if you don't mind, I'd like to explain how diabetes works. It's always good to have that basis.
Yeah, for sure.
In a normal body, when you ingest food, it gets broken down into sugar, which is called glucose. It's a very simple form of sugar. That glucose circulates in your bloodstream, and it needs to get into your body cells in order to give them energy. Now, when your pancreas senses that there's glucose in the blood, it produces a hormone called insulin. Insulin's job is to act like a key. It goes in the bloodstream along with the glucose, and it acts as a key to open the cell walls to allow the glucose in. Now, with diabetics, that system is broken. In the case of type 1s, we have an autoimmune disease where our body's immune system attacks the pancreas and it kills the cells that produce insulin. So we don't produce insulin, which means the only treatment for it is to take insulin, and that's got to be taken by injection because insulin breaks down in the stomach. So that's relatively simple. Type 2 is actually more complicated. Type 2s have a condition called insulin resistance. And what that does is exactly what it says. It makes the cells resistant to insulin so that over time it takes more and more insulin to open up those cells.
So there's some sort of adaptation that happens that makes the cells resistant to insulin.
Yeah, it's, as I said, it's called insulin resistance.
Yeah.
We don't know why it happens. They've just completed a study where they show there are at least 117 genes that are related to type 2 diabetes, because the one thing we know about both type 1 and type 2 is that they begin when a genetic predisposition encounters an environmental trigger. And neither one of those are very well understood. That study that I mentioned it's recent. It's just over the past couple of years. We don't really understand the genetics, except to know that there are lots of genes that have a role to play, and they often interact. So if you have interactions among 117 genes, the possibilities are enormous.
Sure.
In fact, it's so complicated that some scientists have said that it's possible that no 2 cases are exactly alike between the variations in the genes and the gene interactions and the environmental factors, which are even less well understood. So it's something that you can't prevent because we don't know why insulin resistance starts in the first place.
Right.
That's the part that gets omitted in discussions about diabetes. People think that, well, if you're overweight, then you're going to get diabetes.
Yeah.
Well, when I put things together, I realized that the Centers for Disease Control tells us that about 70% of us are overweight, but only 10% of us have diabetes. So that's, 1 out of 7 overweight people gets diabetes. So it's not everybody. And on top of that, we have a lot of people who are not overweight, who do watch their diet, who do exercise, who become diabetic. So there's a disconnect here. It's not just those personal factors.
Yeah.
Now, there is fact behind that, though, because once you have insulin resistance, if you're overweight, that does make it worse. What happens is that we have 2 kinds of fat. There's subcutaneous fat, which is the soft, squishy stuff on the outside. But there's also a hard fat that's on the inside of the body that surrounds your organs. It's a hard fat. It's called visceral fat. And the visceral fat is what worsens insulin resistance. It doesn't create it. It just makes it worse. So the idea is to lose weight. And fortunately, when you lose weight, the first weight that goes is the visceral fat. That's why people are told if you lose 5%, 7% of your body weight, you'll make a difference. It's because you're losing the dangerous fat.
Yeah, yeah.
As far as eating sugar goes, that has nothing to do with it at all, except that once you have insulin resistance, if you eat a lot of candy, then you're stressing out your pancreas. You're making your pancreas create more and more insulin, and that helps to wear it out. In the end, when people really have problems with type 2, it's because the pancreas no longer has the capacity to make enough insulin. And that's where the need for drugs and that sort of thing comes in.
Yeah.
So this is a big problem that I see. There's a disconnect in the messaging about why diabetes happens. If everybody thinks that they know the overweight part, and they think they know about the sugar part and the sedentariness part, but all of those come into play after you've got the underlying condition. Now, insulin resistance is not curable. And, my immune disorder, it is not curable either. So once
there's been nothing, no clinical cases where people have been able to reverse anything when it comes to that you're aware of anyways?
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, okay.
And I'll tell you, Rupesh, if there was a way to take care of either one of these things, the scientist that came up with it would be like Jonas Salk. I mean, they would be a very famous person. In fact, back when insulin was first refined enough to use, those guys, I mean, they were scientific guys. They got Nobel Prizes, and they were the toast of the town wherever they went.
Banting and Best, right?
Yes, exactly. Canadians, in fact.
Canadians, in fact. And just a really quick story. So Best, Charles H. Best, the elementary school I went to was Charles H. Best Elementary. So isn't that an interesting connection?
Cool. Well, see, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
So, I mean, these guys, and getting insulin to the point where you could use it to save people's lives was huge. But if you could figure out a way to reverse insulin resistance or reverse the autoimmune problem for type 1s, you would be even a bigger hero. Yeah. Because that would mean you wouldn't have to deal with the disease at all.
Yeah, so the thing that's sticking out for me is what you said about, I think people, including myself, I'll admit this, that with, I always thought that those who had type 2 diabetes were largely because of their lifestyle factors, right? Sedentary lifestyle, the way they eat, that sort of thing. I exercise regularly. I eat pretty clean myself. I don't even think about, that doesn't cross my mind at all as far as potentially being at risk for diabetes. I always just think there's no way I could ever have something like that. But what I'm hearing from you is that yes, those could be environmental triggers though for type 2 diabetes, but there's so much about the genetics we don't understand that could be potentially causing this for people who don't have those sort of lifestyle factors that we typically think of that are associated with type 2 diabetes.
Right. And that's what people really should understand. The best way to determine your risk is to look at your family history.
Okay.
If there's a history of diabetes, you likely have the genes that will make you susceptible to it. It doesn't mean you're going to get it, because you still have to encounter that trigger in the environment. But since we don't know what they are, then it's the luck of the draw, basically.
Yeah.
There are other factors too, like blacks, for example, have a higher rate, but genetically they're just more susceptible to it. That's
interesting.
It's not a racial issue per se. It's a scientific fact. So this is something that community has to deal with in a greater way. But talking about these things like the weight, this is where the messaging really gets confusing, and it's a reason people don't understand how it really starts. We have, even in the medical community, they'll tell you that you can cure diabetes, or you can reverse diabetes, or that you put it in remission, or you can prevent diabetes. Well, it's the way they define it. They say that you don't have diabetes until your sugar level reaches a certain point.
Okay.
So that's why we have a term pre-diabetes. Once you get insulin resistance, the blood sugar will gradually rise. And when your doctor detects that there's a higher blood sugar, he'll say, well, you're heading in that direction of diabetes, pre-diabetes. So until you hit that diabetic level, they tell you don't have it. Now, if you go over that level, which frankly, even normal people go over the level when you eat, especially a high carb meal, your blood sugar fluctuates. It goes, it gets digested, goes high, then it gets absorbed into your body and it goes back down. So, even normal people get higher blood sugars temporarily. With diabetics, they will stay high unless you do something about it. So that's a big difference. But here's the problem. When people are told they have diabetes, it means that you've chronically got a blood sugar that is over that diabetic level. And they say that if you can drop it down below that level, then you have cured diabetes. Well, it's really twisting the everyday usage of the word. When we think of cure, we think, well, it's done. I'm not going to have to deal with this anymore. But that's not the case. If you bring it down below, and they say, well, you're cured because you're below that level, but then you go out and eat 3 candy bars, you're going to be uncured in a heartbeat. So it doesn't mean you don't have to deal with it. You still have to deal with it because the underlying cause, which is insulin resistance, is always going to be there. When people talk about preventing diabetes, what they're talking about is keeping your blood sugar from getting over that diabetic level.
Right.
But the way you do that is by treating your body the same way you would as if you had diabetes. You have to watch what you eat. You should exercise and do all those things. Yeah. Sometimes you even take medications for it. Yeah. But that will never go away. And that's the thing. I think the general public, some people anyway, will think, well, actually, this is part of the stigma. The people are likely to think, well, you could have prevented this, but you didn't. You could cure it, but you don't.
Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah. There's a choice in the matter, right?
Yeah. And it's just not the case. Now, the way I believe they should present it is to say just what I said earlier. You've got insulin resistance. You're going to have to deal with this for the rest of your life. The question is, how well do you deal with it? Do you deal with it well enough to keep your blood sugars below the diabetic level? If it's higher, are you dealing with it well enough to keep it moderately higher so that you won't have complications? If you just recast it that way, you would take the stigma out because people would know you couldn't prevent it and you can't cure it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So that's the kind of thing that I discovered where, I'm taking just the scientific facts that everybody agrees on and remessaging it so that we take the stigma out. And this is something that is really bothersome. In the world of diabetes, we have a term for people who are critical of diabetics.
There's a term for this?
Yes.
Okay.
They're called the diabetes police.
Okay.
And if you read diabetes publications around the holidays, around Christmas, where everybody's going to parties, the question is, well, how do I deal with somebody who comes up to me and says, they see the cookie in my hand and they ask me if I should really be eating that? You know, it's that kind of thing. Or they'll just stand there and look at you like, you know, what a fool you must be. You've got a diabetes. You've got diabetes and sugar is poison for you. What are you doing? In fact, sugar is not poison for diabetics. You just have to be cognizant of how much you're eating.
Right.
But I eat sugar. I eat ice cream. But, you know, I'll not eat something else instead to cover for that.
Yeah.
I'll tell you an incident that actually happened to me. I was in a restaurant. We had a banquet for Christmas. It was a Polish restaurant. So I ordered the Polish platter. It had kielbasa. It had pierogies, which are basically turnovers, some sauerkraut, a couple of pieces of bread. And I had a guy next to me said, "You going to eat all that?" And I said, "Well, let me tell you just what I'm going to do." I said, "I'm only going to have one piece of bread." And I'm looking at those galokis, which are stuffed cabbage. I said, just about half of that is rice. You know, rice is carbohydrates. So I'm figuring that's worth a slice of bread right there. So there's a trade-off. I can eat the kielbasa. I can eat the sauerkraut because that's not going to raise my blood sugar at all. So I told him, that's what I'm going to do. Watch me. So I did that. And I saw him the following day. And he said, "So how did it go after you ate that meal?" I said, "You know what? When I got up this morning, my blood sugar was 114, which is perfect." I said, but that's the kind of thing you need to do. A diabetic has to look at his plate and ask himself, where are the carbohydrates? Because the carbohydrates raise the blood sugar.
They're the ones that spike things, yeah.
They do. And this is interesting, too. You can take a gram of carbohydrate, like a gram of bread, for example. When that bread gets digested, it raises the sugar exactly as much as a gram of sugar. So you have to recast the way you look at food and know what the carbohydrates are, because that's how important it is to regulate that food.
Is there, I mean, we hear a lot about obviously simple carbs and complex carbs. And I mean, at the end of the day, it all gets broken down into those molecules, right? But any difference from as a diabetic in how you look at simple and complex carbohydrates?
Well, for me personally, no.
Okay.
One thing I have learned is that my knowledge of diet is minimal, and I know what's worked for me. You know, I look at the total carbohydrates. You can find out by reading a nutrition label, or you can ask Alexa, which is great. You know, Alexa, how many carbs in an ear of corn? It should tell you 25. So it's really handy. There are lots of ways to get that information, but I don't delve into the details of how stuff gets digested. I'm just a regular guy trying to live my life. As long as I can identify those carbs, I can adjust for them. And it's never going to be perfect anyway. If you look at a nutrition label, they're really wonderful things because the facts are right there.
Yeah.
But with those nutrition labels, they have a margin of error of 20%. So, you know, everything is just a roundabout approximation of what you're dealing with.
Right.
But still, it's good information. Back when I first got diabetes 40 years ago, none of this stuff existed. You know, you had very few sugar-free products, which is another issue too, by the way. You know, we didn't have ways of testing our blood sugar. I mean, it was really the Wild West where you were flying by the seat of your pants. Yeah,
ingredients weren't labeled properly. Like now, the order of ingredients is pretty much, you know, whatever the majority to the least majority that's in the product, right? Like it's all organized real well for consumers.
It is, and this is another thing that diabetics need to know. You know, you look at that label, and anything that ends in OSE, you know, that's a carbohydrate. That's a sugar. But you're right. You look at that label, and if those things with the OSE are on the top of the list, you should really think about this thing. You know, maybe you still eat it, maybe not all of it.
Yeah.
You know, it's just an adjustment that needs to be made.
Is the goal to really keep just like the chronic blood sugar levels into in a manageable way? Then is like, like you said, blood sugar fluctuates from time to time, but as long as in a chronic way you're keeping that in a certain range or whatever, is that really then the goal for everybody?
It's to keep it low enough so that you don't have complications.
Yeah.
I think we've all heard the horror stories about, amputations and blindness and those things, they do happen. I know people they've happened to.
Why do those happen, by the way? I've never really looked into that.
Well, they happen because when your blood sugar is chronically high, it just hurts your entire circulatory system. With blindness, for example, it'll weaken the blood vessels in the eye. They rupture, and the blood that flows out of that rupture gets into that aqueous fluid in the middle of the eye, and it clouds the vision.
Okay.
And if that's not treated, it just builds up, and you can't see. That's another thing today, by the way. Diabetics need to get an eye exam at least once a year.
Okay.
Because the doctors can actually see where a blood vessel is starting the process of rupturing, and you can go in there with laser surgery and take care of that. So you can prevent the blindness. But you've got to be attentive. You got to get to the ophthalmologist and listen to what he says. With amputations, it's typically the feet and legs that have the problem. That's because they're the farthest away from the heart.
So blood pools.
It pools, right?
Yeah,
you don't have the blood pressure down there that you have in the rest of your body. So, really your blood goes everywhere. And that higher blood sugar level just hurts everything. Kidneys go also. Cardiovascular disease is big. But this is one of the reasons that exercise is a critical part of diabetes care. And this is another problem that I see. I actually used to go to diabetes classes. They would have them in various locations. I went to one, and it was a canned program. It was done by one of the pharmaceutical companies, and it was given by the hospital staff. They had diabetes people there who taught about it. And it started off explaining what diabetes is, much as I described earlier. And then it talked about food, pretty much the same stuff I just talked about. But then it talked about pharmaceuticals. And the only time exercise was brought up was when I brought it up. And they said, yeah, you're right. That is absolutely important. But it wasn't part of the curriculum that was presented. So the CDEs, Certified Diabetes Educators, who were presenting the course, they just stuck with the script. But once I brought it up, they reiterated that it is important. Now, one of the reasons it's important is that it just keeps your blood mechanically flowing through your blood vessels. So the more active you are and the faster that blood flows and the more regularly it flows, the less chance there is of plaque buildup due to the high blood sugar. So it is critical. Interesting story. I've written a couple of books, and the person who did the design work on the diabetes book contacted me one time, and she said, I've got type 2 diabetes, and my doctor gave me this prescription. I went to the pharmacy, and they told me it's going to cost $500. So I told them, take it back. I'm not spending $500 for this medication. So she said, I did the design work on your book, but I never read it. So I sat down and read it. And when I got to the part about exercise, that's what I started doing. I started walking 20 minutes a day, every day, and I started watching my carbohydrates. And she said she lost like 20 pounds over 3 months, and her blood sugars came right down to where they needed to be. So she went to her doctor after that 3 months, and she said he was amazed. He said, how did you do this? She said, well, I read Galaska's book. But then she talked about the exercise. And she said, really, the exercise is what does it. And this is curious too, Rupesh. I've exercised my entire life, and I've worked out pretty hard for most of it.
Mm.
But one of the things that I discovered is if I work out really hard, my blood sugar actually rose. It didn't go down like I expected it to.
Mm.
And I finally figured out that what happens is that when your blood sugar goes down, which it did while I was exercising, your liver both stores and creates glucose.
Mm-hmm.
And when it sees that you need the glucose, it just bombs it into your system.
Mm-hmm.
So what would happen is I would be dropping the blood glucose. The liver would say, okay, here you go, and throw all this glucose into my blood with the result that it was higher. Well, when I started reducing my exercise a little bit to prevent it from going that low, everything worked the way it should.
Mm.
So you could have a low blood sugar at the end of your workout because you didn't trigger the liver.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is something that people need to know also. It's not heavy gym workouts that you need to do.
Mm-hmm.
It's activity as much as you can do it during the course of a day.
Absolutely.
And that includes things you already do, whether it's walking around the house, doing your vacuum cleaning, walking up and down the stairs, taking care of the kids. Whatever makes your skeleton move is exercise. And the low level of exercise is really effective in helping control your blood sugar.
You're just getting that circulatory system moving, right?
Well, you get it moving, but also something else happens. When you're exercising, it makes your muscles more receptive to glucose. Mm. So your muscles will take the glucose right out of the bloodstream, and they'll either store it for future use or they'll burn it right away. Mm-hmm. So it's a natural process that just happens.
Yeah.
So the key isn't to be out there training for a marathon. It's just to keep your body moving, which what it boils down to is you can't just be a couch potato. If you're sitting around not doing anything, you're literally killing yourself.
Yeah.
But if you get up and even go for a walk around the block, you're doing yourself a world of good. Yeah.
You talked about, when you're exercising, you get this sort of rush of glucose entering your blood. I had this experience where, I usually exercise right in the morning. I don't eat anything. I've been able to get to a place where I can exercise on an empty stomach and feel fine. Like I don't have any sort of low sugar effects. But when I first started doing it, I would get those kind of low sugar effects that you talked about when you started the episode, right? Where you get the sweats and you get and all that. I imagine though, the liver also when you wake up is that glycogen stores are down, right? Like they're pretty much, that's why you got to break the fast, so to speak, is what traditionally they say, right? So,
well, it's funny you would mention this. The liver is really, in my book, I've got a chapter called the wildcard.
Okay.
It's all about the liver.
Okay.
Because it does things that you can't control, and it does them at times where you wouldn't expect. It's, sometimes things happen with diabetics, and you think, well, this should have happened, but it didn't. And generally, it's because the liver did something on its own. What happens with the liver is that there's something called the dawn effect.
Okay.
Even in normal people, the liver will release sugar into your bloodstream because, you've got the circadian rhythm. It knows when you're going to wake up, and it knows you're going to need energy when you get up. So it automatically raises your blood sugar before you get up. Mm-hmm. So that's another one of those liver things.
Yeah. Yeah, it is really, really fascinating. I want to go back to what are the effects though of those low blood sugar states on your health? Is there any sort of contribution there towards developing insulin resistance? That seems counterintuitive, but you did bring it up, and so I'm wondering if there's any sort of issue there, if people are always in kind of this low blood sugar state, or they have these kind of downward spikes, so to speak, in their blood sugar.
Yeah, I don't know of any firm scientific opinion on that, but I can tell you that my CDE, again, that stands for Certified Diabetes Educator. Diabetics need to know about them. These people really know their stuff. And the most valuable information I've gotten about diabetes is from them. My CDE once told me that I should really be careful about low blood sugars. She had one patient who was a little older than me, and he developed dementia and those sorts of problems afterwards. And she believed that his chronic low blood sugars had something to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
But again, that's just an anecdotal thing that I happen to have been told.
Yeah.
This is another thing that's hard about diabetes. We want to keep our blood sugars as low as we can. And to do that, especially if you take insulin or some of the type 2 drugs, you can get that low blood sugar. So you don't want to go over that line, but you're trying to keep your blood sugar as low as you can, but it can't go too low. You got to always be cognizant of that. And it's going to go low sometimes, but you just have to be aware of it and take care of it when it happens. Talking about blood sugars and where you want it to be as a diabetic, in my experience, and I think probably in the experience of every other diabetic, it's really hard to keep your blood sugar in the normal range. It's very narrow. It's very hard to get in there and stay there without going low. And the diabetes people know this. What they ask you to do is to keep your blood sugar higher than normal, because even though it's higher, most of us can get through without having the complications of amputations and blindness and all that stuff, which is really the key thing. We have a test called the A1C. What it does is it measures your blood sugar on average for the previous 3 months, and that really shows what kind of control you've had. A normal A1C is under 5.7.
Okay.
If you're between 5.7 and 6.4, that's pre-diabetes. If it's 6.4 or over, it's called diabetes. Now, well-controlled diabetes is anything 7 or below. So it is marginally higher. It's marginally higher than pre-diabetes, but it's not marginally higher than normal. The difference between 5.7 and 7.0 is significant. But at least at 7.0, you should be doing okay. And that's something that is attainable. In fact, my last few years, mine's been running 6.6, 6.7.
Okay.
And I won't even try to get it lower than that because I know I'm skirting trouble if I do that. But here I've had it for, 42 years so far. And I'm doing okay. And there are people who have had diabetes for 60, 70, 80 years who live good lives. But they need to be attentive.
Yeah. I was, something that you said earlier really surprised me, was just the lack of understanding of the benefits of exercise, like on this whole thing. Like that I imagine though now everyone understands that, or is it still something that's not a major focus for...
Rupesh, it's not a major focus, and that's what the problem is.
Okay. Well, that surprises me. Like how this is. Maybe I could understand that earlier, but I don't know. Maybe a bit biased to this because I exercise myself. But yeah, I don't know. That surprises me.
This has been known for a long, long time. In fact, one of the doctors at the Joslin Diabetes Center coined the term magic bullet. A magic bullet is a simple solution to a complex problem. And he said that exercise is the magic bullet. And it is. When you have a high blood sugar, if you go for a walk, it will drop your blood sugar. Period. It's a magic bullet. And this is another thing that I find annoying to no end. We see all these advertisements on TV with these happy diabetics dancing in the street because they took this medication. Well, if you look at the inserts in every one of those medications, which I have actually done, every single one of them says you've got to use diet and exercise. But somehow exercise never gets mentioned. I just don't get it. But that's something that's another thing in the messaging. The information is out there. The medical people know that how this works. Why don't you make it a big deal to say, look, go for a walk, do your housework yourself, whatever. But they don't.
I think it was late last year. I had somebody on the podcast. He's a professor from the University of Toronto and also a medical doctor, and he was telling me about how the pharmaceutical industry gets itself involved with medical doctors, like what that looks like, whether it starts when you enter med school, and there's sometimes special seminars that the pharmaceutical industry offers to doctors, and then especially more in the States, but even in Canada, sales reps that come to doctors and speak to these things, and it's just part of the culture, but I wonder from your end, like, what does the pharmaceutical industry get right when it comes to supporting folks with diabetes, and what do they get wrong in your mind?
I think they do a lot of good because the medications they come up with really do help. There's no question about that. I'm not inferring that you could avoid high blood sugars just by diet and exercise. For a variety of reasons, that is a very, very hard thing to do. And the medications do help. When you've done your best with the diet and exercise and you still can't control it, these medications certainly help. So they're doing the right thing by developing the medications. But here again, see, the problem is messaging. It's that's all it is. They should be talking about, instead of making medications the primary way to control diabetes, it ought to be the diet and exercise first. Do the best you can and then maintain that with a medication. Now, here's the thing with medications. You need to have some sort of a stable lifestyle in order for those medications to work. If you're a couch potato one day, sitting there eating chips and watching TV, and you're taking your medication, your blood sugar is going to be higher than it should. If the next day you are good, you eat healthy, you go for a walk, it's going to be a whole different thing. The doctor needs to have you give the drug a stable body to work with. And if your behavior is all over the place, well, the medication is going to stay the same. It's not going to be as effective as it should be if you didn't present a moving target.
Yeah.
When you vary your activity like that, that's what you are. You're a moving target. I kind of shudder sometimes. People will tell me, gee, I have this doctor, and doctor gave me this medication, and man, it worked great. How come the other 3 doctors didn't come up with this? And then they're out there telling all their friends, go to this guy. He's got the magic medication. Well, you did something. Maybe you cleaned up your act and you had a better lifestyle right after you got it. Maybe your doctor told you, go ahead and go for a walk, and maybe you did that. We have this perception that all you do is take a pill a day and the problem is solved. Yeah. And it's not. It's not.
No. Yeah. It's such an over reliance. Absolutely. I want to talk a little bit more about the stigmas and such and that diabetics often experience. But in terms of on the diet side, I know you kind of expressed how you approach eating, but you hear, there's so many different kind of fad diets and such. Yep. But one that's obviously gotten a lot of attention in the last few years, and I don't know if you've looked at this at all. It's something that I actually undertake is intermittent fasting. I do a kind of a 16-8 protocol where 16-hour fast, and sleep contributes to that, and so it makes it easy, and then 8 hours of eating. And I've felt great, and it manages, things really well from not that I've ever really been, my metabolism generally, thankfully, has always been fairly good. But yeah, any comments on certain diets or things that you think, that you've seen work, or intermittent fasting in particular?
Yeah, I haven't tried any of those diets. I focus on my blood sugar. What am I going to do? Am I going to work out? If I'm going to work out, I'm going to have to eat some carbs before I do it because I know they're going to be burned. I will say this, though. I've looked at the keto diet, and I guess that works for people. But what the one great thing about the keto diet is that they have come up with all kinds of low-carb recipes. So if you're looking for a sort of good-tasting food that's low-carb, you can go to some of these keto books and get some pretty good recipes out of them. So for me personally, I guess that's the only real contact I have with a special diet.
Yeah. With
diabetic diets, what we're asked to do really is eat a healthy diet. Make sure you got a plate with your greens and protein and whatnot. By the way, protein does not raise your blood sugar. So you can eat all the meats you want to, fish, eggs, so I tell people I do, when I have lunch, instead of a full sandwich, I'll make a half a sandwich, but I'll load it up with a lot of chicken, so you can feel full, but you don't eat all that bread. So it's, when it comes to diet, those are the kinds of trade-offs that I make. Yeah. And by the way, I want to give a shout out to my wife.
It's always a good thing.
Well, I'll tell you, my wife is a good cook, and almost always we have well-balanced meals. So I can't take credit for that because I don't make it, but it's always there. And I, in addition to the exercise, I think that's been a big part of my success with this.
Yeah, that's great. The healthcare industry itself, we talked a little bit about the pharmaceutical industry, but in the United States in particular, like in Canada, we have health insurance that each of the provinces and territories provide to citizens here in Canada, or to residents, I should say. But in the United States with private healthcare insurance, is there any sort of discrimination that happens, or is there, like, how do you feel like the treatment of diabetics is when it comes to coverage by the healthcare industry?
I can't help you, Rupesh. I just don't know.
Yeah.
I have private health insurance, so I'm not struggling with the state insurance that gets provided for low income people. I do not know. I do think it's much harder for people on the lower end of the economic spectrum to deal with diabetes well. And this is something I would really like to work on. The biggest problem, number one, is that people don't understand the impact that carbohydrates have on their blood sugars. The problem is that those are the cheap foods that people eat.
Yeah.
You go to the bodega and pick up some Twinkies or whatever. I mean, it's cheap, tastes good, but it kills you. But if you want to eat a balanced meal and eat a lot of protein to help keep your blood sugar down, well, protein tends to be expensive. Chicken maybe not so much, but I would love to develop ethnic recipes that taste great and are cheap. And that's one thing that we ought to be doing. I once gave a talk, believe it or not, to a group of homeless people. Now, these people clearly do not have the money to really deal with diabetes well, but still they have diabetes. And at this breakfast they had grits, scrambled eggs, and sausage. And it was kind of a perfect example because I told them, of these things, if you like grits, have some. But load up on the egg and on the sausage because neither one of those will raise your blood sugar. A friend of mine, I was talking to him about this, and he says, Chet, you wouldn't believe how much sugar we put in Kool-Aid. So I made it a habit of asking these guys, you guys like Kool-Aid? Oh, yeah, we like Kool-Aid. How much sugar you got it? You put in it, and they all had their different recipes. You had to cool the water first, and then put the sugar in a little bit at a time, or X, Y, Z. There's all kinds of variations on it. But this, culturally to me, this was news. I had no idea that this was going on until my friend mentioned it. But this is a kind of thing that somebody needs to talk about. You got to be aware that this is what's happening. I also know of people who will drink 2 liters of sugar soda a day. Well, these are simple behaviors that if you've got diabetes, you got to stop doing that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, literally, they are killers. So if we could get into these communities and just explain this stuff simply, they can do themselves a world of good just by avoiding those really damaging behaviors.
Yeah, on the Kool-Aid front, interesting. I remember when I was a kid and the first time I made Kool-Aid, because I had people prepare it for me before, but I made it as a kid and I just put the package into the water and tried it, and I was like, oh my goodness, this is disgusting. And then I realized I had to add a cup of sugar, and that's when I understood, wow, the amount of sugar that goes into something like that. I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense what you're saying as far as you need to educate and provide awareness of the impacts of these things. Also, to your point, though, some of these low-income communities, the access to healthy foods, as we know, is not there, right? Like everything around these communities is fast food joints and convenience stores, and where there's not proper supermarkets or access to healthy foods, and right now, obviously, with inflation so high, it's putting even more pressure on folks, right?
Yep, so, it's a bad situation.
Yeah.
But educating people in a way that they understand what's going on is critical, because you can have as many supermarkets as you want. If people don't understand why they should be paying a little bit more for healthy food, they won't do it.
That's true.
And that, another aspect of this that is damaging is the fact that everything is in short segments these days. This is why I like doing podcasts. We get a chance to sit down and talk about this thing and get into details that you wouldn't get otherwise. And a lot of it is very basic stuff that ought to be out there. But you can't do it in a 30-second commercial or a 3-minute news story, or, you just don't have the opportunity to do it. And the shortness isn't just in the media, it's in doctor's visits. At least down here in the States, you go to the doctor, you'll be with him for 10 minutes, and 5 minutes he's looking at his computer. And so they certainly, even if they were going to explain all the stuff we've talked about, they don't have anywhere near enough time to do it.
Chet, when you get to know me, there are not many things that get me riled up, but doctor visits definitely get me riled up. The way it's similar here. I mean, some doctors, will have a roster of patients, and they're able to provide more dedicated care where they'll address multiple issues and kind of look at things holistically. But it's not common. Similar to your experiences there, like you go in, sometimes doctors will only allow one issue per visit.
Yep.
Some of these things, especially treating diseases, are complicated things, right? Like you can't just address them in 3 or 4 minutes. It's that definitely gets me riled up for sure.
But this thing is doable. With the classes that I gave, I haven't done the classes since before COVID, by the way.
Which classes?
It's called the Challenge Diabetes Program.
Oh, okay.
Okay, what I do is I talk to groups, and it's a 3-week program where I lay out essentially the stuff that we've talked about. It's just plain and simple. This is what you got. This is what you got to do. In plain language, without getting into all these scientific explanations. Like I've gone to a number of diabetes programs, and especially with the ones that are run by dietitians, they always do this thing where they take a piece of wheat and they say, well, this the outside of the part of the wheat is, that's not the carbohydrate. It's on the inside, and they go through all this stuff. Well, I don't do any of that stuff. It's just basically, these are carbohydrates. They're just like sugar. You have to watch them. And this is how just into the nuts and bolts of every day, this is how you can manage it. If we were able to get that out more widely, it doesn't have to be me doing it or even my program, but just have a sensible program that spoke everyday English and told people what they were up against, it would make a huge difference.
Yeah.
And by the way, I've done a number of these, and one of the real joys of it is that when I explained that you did not get diabetes because of something you did, I've had people come up to me afterwards and say, the best thing you told me was that I didn't cause this. I spent all this time on a guilt trip because I thought there was something. And you know what? When you talk to other people about diabetes, almost everybody will say, well, I don't know why he got it, but he ate too much sugar. Or, there's always one of those simple explanations that is simply not true that they come up with. So you wind up with diabetics walking around feeling blamed and shamed for having this. I had one woman, this was a class that I actually gave at a medical clinic. This woman was overweight, and she broke down in tears because her father kept on her about her weight. And he kept telling her, if you just would lose the weight, you wouldn't have the diabetes. And he was on her all the time about this. And she's not going to lose insulin resistance no matter how much weight she loses. But that's another reason the public needs to be educated. We don't come down on people with other diseases and blame them for it. In fact, there was one researcher said that diabetes is one of the few diseases in America today where it's socially acceptable to blame the victim. Well, it's not like, that may work for people who smoke heavily, who get lung cancer or COPD. You can say, okay, there's a direct correlation between, what you've got and your behavior. So fine, maybe that's another one you can blame the victim on. But that's not the case with diabetes. You didn't cause it. But as long as people have those attitudes, diabetics are reluctant to talk about it. Myself, I had it for 30 years before I told anybody I had it. The only people that knew were people who really needed to know that I had diabetes, because I didn't want people thinking that I was less able or weaker than anybody else.
Or you didn't have, perhaps you didn't want people to have that perception that you weren't managing your lifestyle properly or all these kind of things, right?
Just avoid all of it, right? The easiest way to avoid it, you don't want to have to explain it every time you turn around. And you don't want, and in the back of people's minds that they're thinking that, well, you did something. I don't know what it was, but you did something. But this has tragic consequences. I spoke to a former employee a few years ago. He was in a wheelchair. He told me that he had diabetes, and he didn't do anything about it. So after a while, he couldn't take the pain anymore. So he went to the hospital. They took one leg off on one day and the other one off on the next day. So now he's in a wheelchair. He died a few years later. Now, he told me that if I ever got diabetes, to make sure I take care of it. Now, I had known this guy for probably 40 years, and he didn't have a need to know, so he didn't know I was diabetic.
Yeah.
But today, I wonder, if he knew I was diabetic, maybe he would have asked me about it, and maybe I would have told him the same things I'm telling you, and maybe he'd still be alive today. But that's the real damage that comes from the stigma. When people don't want to talk about it and don't share with other people, and they're not open to other people approaching them, this is what happens. You've got a whole community of diabetics that just doesn't want to talk about it.
Yeah, because they're afraid of what people might say and how the shame and blame and all that kind of comes up, right?
Yeah, and if people just knew the facts about insulin resistance and the autoimmune disease, all of that would go away. Then you could just be somebody who's got an underlying condition they didn't ask for and is doing their best to fight it. A whole different attitude. Yeah.
So on that then, what would you want people to know as the key takeaway for when it comes to becoming diabetic versus the key takeaway in managing your diabetes? Because I'm hearing two different things, and I think it's important for people to know.
Sure. Well, the first thing to know is that you did not cause diabetes. It happened because you've got a genetic predisposition and something in the environment triggered it. So you are not to blame for that. We just don't know how to prevent it. So once you've got that condition, you are in a fight for your life every day of your life, unless somebody comes up with a cure, which is not on the horizon right now. So you're in the battle. The question is how well you can control your blood sugar so that you don't suffer consequences and are able to live a long, healthy life. You need to know that carbohydrates raise your blood sugar, and you need to manage those. That's partly by knowing what they are and then having a little willpower to modify what you're eating to reduce them. The other is to understand that everyday exercise has a powerful effect on controlling your blood sugar, and you need to work that into your lifestyle, and that is not a life-changing thing in that you've got to do a certain workout every single day. The impact of exercise actually lasts for 2 or 3 days, so you could skip a day and you would still benefit from it. And those are the two most important things. Watch the diet and the exercise, and watch what you eat, and you can control it.
Yeah.
So, but these are not easy things to do. Mm-hmm. That's another thing. People, I mentioned the TV ads the other day. I saw one recently where, people were literally dancing in the street. They took this medication, and all is well with the world,
That's every drug commercial I see. Yeah.
They're all of them. I know, they're all of them.
Yeah.
But, don't take that at face value. You still need to do these things if you're going to control it.
Yeah. So,
but, I guess that's about it.
And then what about for type 1 diabetics in terms of managing things? Is that I don't want to simplify or understate this, but is it a simpler sort of treatment solution in that case, or is it also very difficult and challenging for those compared to those who are suffering from insulin resistance?
Well, here's the ironic thing. People generally seem to think that type 2 is not as serious as type 1 because type 1s have to take insulin. Mm-hmm. The day I was put on insulin, I said to myself, well, you're going to be taking these shots every single day for the rest of your life, so get used to it. Mm-hmm. And I haven't missed a day ever. And I usually have taken many more than just one a day to control it. On the face of it, that sounds like it's worse. But the fact is that I can adjust my insulin so that if I am eating a high-carb meal, for example, I don't tell anybody to forgo your favorite food forever. Mm-hmm. If you want to have some spaghetti and really live large for a day, I can do that, but I can also give myself more insulin to cover those extra carbs. Mm-hmm. So I can control my blood sugar by that. Mm-hmm. With type 2s, they don't have that advantage unless they are on insulin as well, and many type 2s are on insulin. But if you're not, you don't have that flexibility of adjusting your insulin to the food that you eat. Mm. So personally, maybe it's because I'm just used to having type 1 for all these years, but I think type 1 is easier. I asked my endocrinologist one time whether type 2s had better luck than type 1s, and she said, it all varies based on the individual. I have type 1s like you who control their blood sugars very well. Mm-hmm. I have type 2s who are completely off the rails, who are in serious trouble. So they're different things, but they're both deadly serious. They produce the high blood sugar, and whether it's from type 1 or type 2, high blood sugar is high blood sugar, and it's going to do the damage.
Before we get into the last two questions, there's something that's maybe not fully straight in my head, and that is, you said for type 2 diabetes, you're not in control of causing it. It's the environmental triggers that sort of, there's a genetic predisposition, and it's the environmental triggers. When you say environmental triggers, though, just define that a little bit more, because we've also talked about like when you are diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, the management of that, your lifestyle can have an influence on whether that's managed well or not. In terms of the environmental triggers, are we saying that your diet, your lifestyle, are those part of the triggers in any way, or what are you saying here?
We just don't know.
Okay.
We don't know. Okay. We don't know about type 1 either. I know you asked me about type 2, but in my case, I never used to get sick. In fact, I still almost never get sick. Mm-hmm. But when I was 29 years old, I was sick as a dog. I was on the sofa for 2 days, and I couldn't even move. Mm-hmm. And then it was over. And then within a matter of a month or two, I realized that things were definitely wrong. And in my case, I believe that it was a virus that triggered it. And that is one of the things that could trigger type 2 also. It could be anything, Rupesh. They just really don't know.
Okay. All right. I mean, that's, to some extent, it is like you said. You had some examples of people who came to your classes and cried and were so happy for them to hear that, right? Like that that it wasn't in their control that they got this. But it's also it is kind of scary though as well to think that, okay, you don't know exactly what those triggers could be. Like you hope that if you eat well and you exercise, you live a generally healthy lifestyle, that for many other diseases, you're reducing the risk factors. I don't know if I'm hearing that from you in this case, because like you said, we just don't know.
I've got a friend. For years, we played in a pickup basketball game every week. Mm-hmm. He's thin. He has always watched his diet. Mm-hmm. It's always worked out. Mm-hmm. And he became type 2. Mm-hmm. And, he and I went out to lunch one day and he said, yeah, I got diabetes. Can't figure out why. And then I told him why. Mm-hmm. It's truly a mystery. When you see people who really have done everything right and they still get type 2, that's what the answer is. It's out there and there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah. Are you okay if we move to the 2 questions I ask every guest?
Absolutely.
All right. So the first one is our 5 for dinner question. Dead or alive, who are 5 people you'd want to have supper with?
Okay. At first blush, I thought of a TV show that Steve Allen had years ago. Mm-hmm. Steve Allen was one of the first hosts of The Tonight Show. Mm. But this guy was a genius. He was a history buff. Mm. And he had this program called Meeting of Minds. And he would have random historical characters come in. There were actors who dressed as the characters they were, and they were well-versed in the history of that character. And they would just sit around and exchange thoughts and ideas. So some of the ones he had, and you got to picture this, they're all sitting around a table. They had Cleopatra, Teddy Roosevelt, Sigmund Freud, Mahatma Gandhi, and Genghis Khan. They're sitting around the room, talking about their views of the world and life. Right. It was hilarious. Yeah. But then I got thinking, if I really could do that, if I could really have 5 people in the room, maybe we could do something productive. So I put together this list. I thought we needed a visionary. So I would have Jules Verne, who wrote novels about going, in the 1800s, he wrote novels about going to the moon in submarines and going to the center of the earth and all this far out stuff that was just totally in his imagination.
Very cool, yeah.
I'd asked Ben Franklin, who was a polymath. I mean, this guy seemed to know everything about everything, including politics and history and all that stuff. Thomas Edison, for obvious reasons. But then I would ask Robert Moses. Robert Moses was a guy who transformed New York City during the Great Depression. Oh. He was able to build freeways, bridges, tunnels. I mean, he really changed the character of New York City over a matter of years. And the reason I chose him was that obviously he knew how to get things done, but he knew the political system well enough to make it happen. And so if you're really going to change things in a positive way, you need to have somebody who really knows the way around that part of the world.
And when was he around?
1930s.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was during the Depression. It was amazing what he was able to do. Yeah. Now, this may sound controversial, but hear me out. I would choose Elon Musk because I want Elon to sit there and listen. Because Elon today is the one guy that if you want to get something done, Elon will get it done. So those would be my 5. Those are amazing 5.
A few of them who I were new and I learned about. So thanks for that. Elon has been on several guest lists for a variety of reasons, but that is a consistent one. Is that not only the visionary part, but he does get things done. sometimes he is a bit more controversial these days, but the work that he's done and is doing is outstanding. Like, he's put the things he's pushed in just a decade is unbelievable.
It is. It
unbelievable.
is.
Yeah.
And suppose you came up with a grand master plan for, okay, we have these problems. This is how we can fix them.
Yeah.
And Elon said, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Let's get this done.
Yeah.
It might happen.
Yeah. Yeah. No, great five. I love it. Last question. Besides the circle of life, what do you know for sure?
Nobody's plans always work out. I don't mean by you, nobody. That was, that was unintentional. But, if you're coming up with a fresh plan, they almost never work out. Sometimes you might get lucky, but there are always twists and turns that you have to adjust for.
Yeah. I love it. Chet, this is unbelievable conversation. First of all, you're a great storyteller. I could just sit here and listen to you and I did, but I could continue to listen to you for a while, just hear you talk about your different stories. Just you raising awareness on this issue, very, very helpful, and appreciate the work that you do on that, and that you even approached me in the show on having you on. I'm so glad that we were able to have you and that we had this discussion. A lot of interesting information, honestly. Like I myself learned about not having control for type 2 diabetes as far as why you get it and the environmental triggers, and we dig into that. But like the management is key, and that makes sense. I think that's going to make a lot of sense to a lot of people. I think it's going to be a bit of I imagine a shift for some minds about the causes of type 2 diabetes. So yeah, just appreciate the conversation overall, and that we talked about this today.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. We're going to put all of Chet's information in our show notes, and like and subscribe and do all those wonderful things, and comment, and look forward to talking to folks in another episode. Thanks, Chet, so much. Appreciate your time.
Okay. You're welcome.
Take care, everyone. See ya.